university.
Meeting is being recorded.
I'm a senior lecturer, and I'm also workshop organizer for BAFA Corporate Governance Special Interest Group. Before we just begin, may I just kindly ask everyone to make sure that your microphones are muted during the presentation, and please make sure to use the Q&A box to post any questions that you have. And we will go through them at the end of the session, at the end of the presentation. This session is going to be for 1 hour. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Renée Adams from University of Oxford, Saïd Business School. She is a leading expert in corporate governance, gender diversity, and board effectiveness, known internationally for her influential research, including women in boardroom and their impact on governance and performance. And today she will presenting her latest research with the title of Selection Matters, the case of women in the sustainable governance debate. So we are very pleased to have her with us today. And Renée, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you. And it's now over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Samane. Hi, everyone. Really nice to see everyone online. Thanks a lot for your interest. So I'm currently at my mom's house because it's half-term vacation. So if you're wondering about the unusual background, that explains it. Which I think, speaks to the juggle that many of us face. We're talking about women today, but also we're talking about men. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to try to keep it short because I'd really love to get questions and feedback. This is a new project that I'm working on, but it's related to a lot of work that I've done before. So yeah, anyhow, I'd love to get feedback. So I'll get right into it. So the project is with Amir Licht. Okay, that's my slides. Let me know if my slides are not advancing. Okay, and I'm on a new computer, so I just need to figure out where everything is. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is sort of what diversity buys you in some sense. Now, many people argue that demographic and cognitive diversity is very important because it changes group characteristics. Around the financial crisis, I don't know if some people didn't notice this hypothesis, but some people did. There was something called the Lehman Sisters hypothesis, which many policymakers put forth. And the argument was essentially that if financial firms and banks had had more women on their boards, then the financial crisis wouldn't have happened. So if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, essentially, the financial crisis wouldn't have happened. And the argument was that if you have more female managers, you would have less risk because, essentially the argument was that women are more risk averse. And so this, as an individual characteristic, you would have less risk. And therefore, you would also have less risk taking, which is a group characteristic. Now, I would, or I often argue, and I'll argue here, that we know very little about these arrows, or much less about these arrows in this, this hypothesis here than we think we do. So I would say we know very little about how the individual characteristics translate into group characteristics. So I think there needs to be much more research on this particular aspect. But I also think that we know less about this first arrow, whether more female managers might lead, in this case, to less risk-taking than we might think. And so the one reason that I think we don't know as much as is commonly argued is that arguments about the characteristics that women have are generally not based on evidence for managers. So like the Lehman Sisters hypothesis is if you have more female managers, then you'll have less risk-taking. But the evidence that's called on for this argument is not actually based on managers. What I'm going to argue is that this makes a difference because managers may be selected, right? So managers may not be representative. So I'm making this argument in the context of the Lehman-Sisters hypothesis because the argument that women are more risk averse is a very standard one. So hopefully this all sounds familiar to you, but now I'm going to be talking about, for the rest of the talk, I'll be talking about other characteristics of women. Now, selection, what do I mean by selection? There's two aspects of selection. There's the demand side, so this is the individual choosing a particular career path. And whether or not you make this choice, I would argue, depends on the social and institutional environment. And there's also the supply side. So you have to be chosen for a particular position, right? So, and then there's lots of interesting questions one might have about who's chosen for a particular role. Is someone who's very different in their characteristics going to be chosen? Do groups actually like homogeneity or do they like heterogeneity? I would argue it's not so obvious. And here also the social and institutional environment may matter. Oh, oops, sorry. Okay. Sorry, okay. So I'm going to talk about this in the context of the sustainable governance debate. And why am I talking about that in this context? Well, I happen to have data that is useful for looking at this issue. Okay, so what's the argument in the sustainable governance debate? So the European Union, for example, argues that, sorry, can you guys see me? I realize my screen seems to have frozen.
Yeah, it's frozen, but I can still see your slide.
Okay, and can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
we can
hear you.
Okay, all right. Okay. So just like yell at me if you think, if there's something going on. I think the internet is a bit bad right now, but anyhow. So hopefully it'll unfreeze in a bit. Okay, so the European Union basically argues that the absence of board gender diversity casts doubts on boards' abilities to understand stakeholder expectations, right? So if we're talking about sustainable governance, then we're interested in stakeholders. And the argument is often that, well, women might have a special role to play in this whole discussion. And what is the argument based on? It's based on this idea that women may be intrinsically more caring towards others or socialized to be so. And so therefore, if you think about caring about stakeholders, it's generally cast in this sort of light about caring about others other than just the corporation or the firm. And so therefore, women might be particularly suited for managing stakeholder expectations. Now, a countervailing view is, I think, very well described by this quote from John Coffey, who's a corporate law scholar. He says, the European Commission's stereotypical assumption that females favor sustainability over profit will prove false if the new directors are chosen by a nominating committee composed of the old directors, which is the standard pattern. The existing board can easily find and predictably will find female directors who fully accept shareholder primacy and care little for sustainability. Okay, so Coffey basically highlights that, well, actually, it's not so obvious that if you just appoint women, the women will necessarily care about stakeholders because the women who care about stakeholders actually won't be appointed. Okay, so I'm going to look at this question in the context of the data that we have, which I'll discuss in a bit. So what we do in this project is first we show that directors are very different from the population, and especially female directors are different from the population. And so the point of showing this is to exactly highlight this point I made at the beginning, is that when you talk about managers or directors, these people are not necessarily representative of the population. Yet people often use population-based arguments to talk about them, but maybe they shouldn't because these people are actually quite different from the population. I'll also show that male and female directors are not so different, but on average, female directors are actually more pro-shareholder, which is exactly the opposite of the standard assumption. So they're not more pro-stakeholder, they're more pro-shareholder than. And then I'm going to provide some evidence that suggests that factors related to the selection process seems to help explain variation in traits. And so there's many, I think, interesting implications of this evidence. But one sort of immediate implication is that if you make assumptions about preferences that are actually flawed, then obviously the policies that you're basing these assumptions on may not work. Okay, so I need to give you a little bit of background to illustrate the main messages. And I'm going to be drawing on two previous papers. One is Adams, Licht, and Sagi from 2011, and then a recently accepted paper in Management Science, which is Adams and Licht 2025. And then I'll briefly discuss those, and then I'll give you the basic results. Okay, so the background is a paper that we published in Strategic Management Journal in 2011. And basically, what we did in that paper is we argued that directors' support for shareholder wealth maximization may vary as a function of personal values. I'll talk about personal values in a second, but we argued, the values that you hold shape your sort of priorities. So you may be, for example, more pro-stakeholder the more other-oriented values you hold. But you may be more pro-shareholder the more you hold what we called entrepreneurial values. So there's a tension. So on the one hand, some of your values may make you more pro-shareholder, but other values may make you more pro-stakeholder. To test this hypothesis, we surveyed the population of directors of listed companies in Sweden. And the key measures of interest there were attitudes towards stakeholders and shareholders, the values that directors held, and we used the Schwartz value framework for this, and personal characteristics. Okay, so basically the measures that I'm going to show you during the rest of the talk are building on this original paper. So I'll just briefly walk you through what we did in that original paper. So basically, the key variable of interest, of course, is how do we measure whether directors care about shareholders versus stakeholders? And so what we did is we said, well, this question of prioritizing one party versus the other party really only becomes interesting in situations of conflict. So if doing something for shareholders takes something away from stakeholders and vice versa, then this is an interesting question. But if in other situations where doing something for shareholders is also good for stakeholders, there's really nothing to discuss. Okay, so we're interested in situations of conflicts, like how do directors decide in situations of conflicts, but we don't really know necessarily what these situations are. And so what we did is we said, we're going to let the stakeholders and shareholders reveal when they're in conflict. And how do they do that? They go to the courts. So we used seminal court cases that involved shareholders on one side and stakeholders on the other side to develop situations or vignettes that describe situations of conflict. And then we use these vignettes to survey directors, and we ask them, well, how would you decide in this particular case? So the cases that we looked at were Dodge versus Ford, which is about shareholders versus consumers. We have a shareholder versus employee case. We have a shareholder versus creditor case and a shareholder versus community case. And we also had a corporate philosophy question, which was basically about, do you put a shareholder-oriented corporate philosophy message on your website, or would you put a stakeholder-oriented corporate philosophy on your website? And I should say that the court found against shareholders in two of these cases, which also highlights that there can be a tension. It's not necessarily obvious in which way these decisions should be decided. Okay, so from the responses to the survey questions, we constructed a measure of shareholderism, which is an average of respondents' answers to 10 items. We surveyed directors on a Likert scale, and so the maximum possible was 6. If you have an answer of 6, that means you were always completely pro-shareholder. The minimum possible is 1, that means you're completely pro-stakeholder. Now, we also constructed, for the purpose of this particular paper, a contractual shareholderism measure, which measures a trade-off between shareholders and stakeholders in the situation when stakeholders are contractually protected. So we're particularly interested in, do you prioritize shareholders or stakeholders in the case of workers, creditors, or maybe even consumers? All of, these are all stakeholders that actually have contractual protection. So, do directors need to consider their interests above and beyond the contractual protection? I think that's an interesting question. Okay, so we have the shareholderism measure. The other thing that's relevant for the purpose of this paper is personal values. So we use the Schwartz human value framework, and they're usually represented in the circular manner up in the right-hand side of my slides. We classified the values that were relevant for shareholderism were power, achievement, and self-direction. So we said if directors are more power-oriented, achievement-oriented, or self-directed, then they're more pro-shareholder. If they're more other-oriented, which means they emphasize universalism as one of the values, then they're more pro-stakeholder. Okay, and this is just briefly a table showing you the results from the original paper. So the dependent variable here is shareholderism. And you see the top three values are the entrepreneurial values. They all load positively. Then we have universalism, which loads negatively, exactly as predicted. So, the more other-oriented you are, the more you as a director are more pro-stakeholder. So that's what the negative coefficient means. Okay, so now that was the original paper, and then we did a follow-up study where we surveyed directors across countries, and we were interested in the role of the institutional environment, and that's why the cross-country nature of the data was important. So I won't go into all of the details in the interest of time, but anyhow, you see that we surveyed many people. Our response rate was pretty atrocious, and we spent a lot of time in the survey in the paper discussing response bias. But essentially, it's the same sort of structure. So we get this measure of shareholderism, and we get the measures of human values. But then we also have the added benefit of being able to look at country-level variables. And so what we do is we also benchmark in this current paper. So I'm taking the data from the Adams and Licht paper, which was accepted in management science. And now I'm benchmarking the directors against the members of the population in the World Value Survey. And that's actually one benefit of using the Schwartz value framework is you also have the Schwartz values for the general population in the World Value Survey. And I'm going to argue this helps us understand directors better by benchmarking directors to the general population. Okay, so I'm going to go right into the data. So what I'm doing here is I have the 4 values that are relevant for shareholder attitudes, which are achievement, power, and self-direction on the top. Then I have universalism, bottom left, and then we also aggregated the top 3 values into a measure of self-transcendence. So that's the bottom right graph. And so what I'm doing here is I'm plotting, so these are all individual values. The blue lines are the measures for directors, and the red dashed lines are the measures for the general population. So these are people in the general population. So we have the same Schwartz values. And now I'm restricting both the directors and the general population to men. So I'm comparing the men to men. Okay, so I think these graphs are pretty interesting. So hopefully you also think they might be interesting. In particular, if you look at power, hopefully you can see my cursor. So power is the middle graph here. And you see that the blue line, which is the power orientation, the distribution of power for directors, is shifted to the right of the red line, which is the distribution of power in the general population. And so what this suggests is that along the dimension of power orientation, directors, male directors are different than men in the general population. It's not just that the mean is different, it's also the distribution is shifted to the right. Okay, if we look at self-direction, we see something similar. So we see men in the director population seem different than men in the general population. Universalism is also shifted, so the distributions look different, and self-transcendence looks different. Okay, so what's the point? Basically, is just to illustrate that male directors may not be typical. Very simple. Okay, so we can do the same thing for the women, right? So exact same structure of graphs. Now, again, if you look at power, for example, you see female directors are shifted to the right on power orientation. So female directors are more power oriented than women in the general population. And the distribution looks different, right? So it's shifted. So again, general point, you look at these graphs, you say, well, maybe directors are not very representative of the general population, right? Which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense, but maybe it's good to look at the data because, the arguments that people make are generally based on arguments about the general population, and maybe we need some, evidence to highlight that maybe that's not such a good argument. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm comparing male and female directors along those same values. So now you look at this and you might say, well, actually, I don't know about you, but I think this is pretty interesting because you don't see these big distributional shifts, right? In fact, I would say that the distributions for male and female directors mirror each other pretty closely, right? So, you wouldn't look at this and say, oh my God, the women are so different from men, right? Among directors. Actually, they look very, very similar. The distributions overlap to a large extent. They have similar shapes. There's a little bit of difference in power here, which we'll get back to, maybe tiny bit in universalism, but really just eyeballing it, you can't really say, it's not like, whoa, you're totally going to change the board if you look at men and women. It's like, maybe not, right? Okay. And now what I'm doing is, so there's a little bit of a shift in power and universalism, both of which are relevant for shareholder orientations. So now I'll show you the results for shareholder orientations. Same sort of idea. I'm just plotting the distributions. So here what I have, before I had values, now I'm looking at shareholderism. Okay, so the blue line now is for female directors. So I have no population benchmark here. It's just directors. And the red line is for the male directors. And so this is the overall shareholderism in the top left. And basically what you see is that the distribution for women is shifted to the right. Right? So on average, the women are more pro-shareholder than the men, and the distribution is also shifted to the right. Okay, now what I'm doing in the next couple of graphs is I'm looking at different components of shareholderism. So I remember before I said there's contractual shareholderism. So how do you think about shareholders versus stakeholders when the stakeholders are contractually protected? And interestingly, you see that both men and women shift a bit to the left, but the men shift more to the left. So the women are more pro-shareholder when stakeholders are contractually protected. And I'll show you the regressions in a bit. They basically confirm this. Now, I also have a measure. You could argue about whether consumers are contractually protected. So in the bottom left, I have the same sort of graph, but I've taken out the consumers. So it's only about workers, creditors, workers and creditors. And you see similar pictures. So the men are more shifted to the left than the women. And then at the bottom right, I have men and women's attitudes or shareholderism when we're talking about situations where the stakeholders are not contractually protected. So this would be, for example, the community or the environment, like this could be about your corporate philosophy. And then you see that men and women track each other pretty closely. So basically, the main divergence between men and women along the shareholderism dimension occurs when stakeholders are contractually protected. And in those situations, the women are actually more pro-shareholder than the men. Okay. So some observations from these graphs are that directors are not typical. It may be hard to see from the graphs, but you can see it from the regressions. Female directors are even less typical, so as compared to the general population. Male and female directors look very, very similar, but they're different, slightly different on two important dimensions. In particular, in the general population, women are less power-oriented and more universalist than men. But among directors, it's the opposite. Women are more power-oriented and less universalist than men. Now, when you think about it, you might say, well, actually, that makes a lot of sense because, it's much harder for a woman to reach a board position. And so a woman who wants to pursue a board position must be power-oriented, right? And maybe she has to be even more power-oriented than the men in order to achieve this position. Or maybe only the women who are very power-oriented are chosen for these positions, right? So there's two-sided selection going on. And then another observation is that female directors are more pro-shareholder than male directors, especially when stakeholders are contractually protected. Okay. So now, so to me, I look at this and I say, look, this looks like selection is going on, right? So, so the data doesn't support the standard stories that people make, that the women are going to be more pro-stakeholder. And so I argue this must be a consequence of selection. Now, to sort of bolster that interpretation, what I'm going to do next is show you some evidence that's I'm trying to dig a bit deeper into the mechanism. So the first question is, well, do institutional characteristics explain this? So that's very simple. What I'm doing is I just put in country fix effects to control for the correlation between country level socialization and the governance environment. And the question there is, if country fix effects matters, that sort of suggests that there could be some selection going on that's caused by institutional characteristics. And then in the second approach, I'm going to look at the role of different types of selection mechanisms. So we have cross-country data, and so what I can do is I can see whether this relationship that women are more pro-shareholder, does that change if, for example, you're in a country with a gender quota? Does it change if you're in a country with co-determination, which means that women may be on the board because they're employee representatives? And so I'm going to look at different types of director selection mechanisms and see whether this relationship changes. Now, I have to say that I don't know if the women in our sample were put on the board as a result of a quota or as a result of co-determination, right? But I think the patterns are generally quite suggestive. Okay, so here what I'm doing first is I'm showing you, now I have the director level data, and this is just a very simple regression. I'm regressing shareholderism. In columns 1, 2, and 3, it's just the overall shareholderism on the female dummy, age, and then I'm decomposing the shareholderism variable into the subcomponents. So we have shareholders versus consumers, shareholders versus workers, shareholders versus creditors, et cetera, et cetera. And then in column 9, I have the contractual shareholderism. I take out consumers from that because, you know, you could argue maybe consumers are not contractually protected. And then in column 11, I have the no contractual protection stakeholders. Okay, and the point here is, so for example, if we look, we see that the female dummy basically loads positively and generally significantly in all columns. So across the board, women it could be argued that the female directors are more pro-shareholder than the male directors. Now, in column 2, we have controls for age, and then in column 3, we had country fix effects. And you see that the coefficient on the female dummy decreases slightly. It's not a lot, but it's suggestive that the institutional environment may influence the types of attributes that women bring to the board. And now I'm going to look at this more systematically. By looking at specific types of director selection mechanisms. So this is sort of a weird table, so just bear with me. So what I've done is I have a regression. So the dependent variable here is shareholderism in columns 1 through 7 and contractual shareholderism in columns 8 through 14. I have the main variables of interest are the female dummy, and then there's a bunch of controls that I haven't shown you. So I'm controlling for individual values, I'm controlling for age, I'm controlling for, let's see, now I can't remember. Anyhow, country level culture, which was sort of the main point of the paper that we just published in Management Science, was to look at culture and the legal system. So there's a bunch of controls that I'm not showing you. But the main variable, the thing that I really want to get at here is different types of director selection mechanisms. Okay, so what we do is so here in the first row beneath female, it says COD, that stands for codetermination. So if you're in a country that allows codetermination, which means that employee representatives may sit on the board, then we argue that directors may be selected through a different process than if you don't have codetermination. Okay. Now, I would argue we actually know very little about how directors are selected in these different sort of institutional environments, but I think the evidence we're showing suggests that there are differences in director selection. Okay, the next we look at if the country has any quota related to women on boards. And so this is could be a corporate quota, it could be a state level quota. So any sort of quota related to having women on boards. And so our argument is, well, if you're in a country where the country has a quota related to women on boards, then directors will be selected in a different manner than otherwise. Okay, so any quota is an aggregate for both just corporate quota. So the next row has is just looking at corporate quota, and then the row beneath that is looking at state level quota. So this is quotas for state-owned companies. Now the row beneath that is a measure of ownership concentration. So we argued that in countries where there's a lot of ownership concentration, directors may be selected through different means than otherwise. And there's a large literature on, for example, there's when the quota was passed in India, there was a lot of discussion about, basically family firms appointing family members to the board to satisfy the quota requirements. So there is a general understanding that if you have very concentrated ownership, the director appointment and selection mechanism may be different than if you don't have a lot of concentrated ownership in a country. The next variable is insider, and so this is whether the director is an executive. So we know whether directors are executives or non-executives. And clearly, the selection mechanism for an executive should be quite different from the selection mechanism for a director. And then finally, this differ from different country. This is a dummy variable that measures whether the director is an expatriate. And so basically, we argue, well, if you're choosing someone from within the country versus someone from outside the country, then you may have a different director selection process. Okay, so the thing that we're interested in is do these types of selection mechanisms moderate the relationship between the female dummy and shareholderism, and if so, how? And what you see, which I think is interesting, is there's a negative coefficient on every single interaction in columns 1 through 7, except for the insider and the expatriate. Okay, so what does that suggest? So for example, let's look at the ownership one, which is actually, so most of these are not significant, but it's interesting that the coefficients are all negative. I would argue this lines up with expectations. So for example, if we look at the ownership concentration variable, this suggests that the negative coefficient suggests that, well, female directors are more pro-shareholder, except if they're appointed as a result of concentrated ownership. And so what you could have in mind there is the example I just gave about like the Indian quota, where they pass a quota in India, and then there was a lot of discussion about companies in India simply appointing family members to the board. And you could say, well, a family member, if you're appointed to the board because of a family connection, your attitudes towards stakeholders might be more consistent with those in the general population. Right? Because you've reached the board through a different mechanism. You're maybe more similar to someone in the general population than someone who's actually had to fight to get there through and obviously some family members in India also have to fight to get there, but it's a different process. And so maybe, the selection effect isn't that dominant. Now, if we look at, for example, the insider, effect. So what does that suggest? It suggests that, well, female directors may be more pro-shareholder, but they're especially more pro-shareholder if they're executives. And I think this is really interesting because, I mean, I don't know about you, but as soon as I see this result, I'm like, well, of course, right? Because you are not going to be chosen as an executive of a listed company. So these are all directors in listed companies. So you're not going to be chosen as a woman to hold a role um, uh, that is where your job is essentially to maximize shareholder value, right? And so if anything, you've got to be more determined to maximize shareholder value than the men, right? So you look at this, you say, well, it has to be the case, right? The women have to have more extreme positions, and whether it's by choice or by being chosen. So I'm not saying anything on that, which I think is like a super interesting area, an important area for research. We don't know, but basically the point is that the women don't have the characteristics that are generally attributed to them, and one reason could be selection. Okay, so all of the coefficients in columns 1 to 7 basically line up, I would say, consistent with intuition. Now, if we look on the right at the contractual shareholderism, a lot of these coefficients, so we get the same negative or positive in the cases where I think it makes sense that they're positive. The signs sort of line up with intuition, but now some of these are significant, whereas with the overall measure they weren't. So for example, if we look at the quota result, so women, this basically suggests that so female directors are generally more pro-shareholder, but less so if they hold a board position in a country that has gender quotas. And again, I think this speaks to the idea that, if you have a quota, you may be choosing from a different pool, and maybe this pool is closer to the general population than the women who are appointed to boards when you don't have a quota, right? So in this case, yeah, so if you have a quota, maybe the women are more pro-stakeholder. That's what this essentially says, right? But in general, that's not necessarily the case. Okay. All right. So now you may say, and I'll explain this table in a second, so sorry it's a bit messy, but trust me, well, it will make sense once I explain it, hopefully. Now you could say, well, so maybe if we have these policies, so what I'm basically arguing is that, because of selection, the female directors don't necessarily have the characteristics that people attribute to them. So people are not thinking about selection when they're making these statements about the characteristics that they have. So then you could say, well, but maybe if we had a quota, right? And that's sort of what the previous table suggested. If we had a quota, then maybe we would get the women with characteristics that we want, right? So if the idea is, well, we say, well, look, we need to have sustainable governance. And so the only way we can have it is having women, because we know, I mean, that's sort of the argument that we know that they're more pro-stakeholder. But now I'm saying, well, not all of the women are going to be more pro-stakeholder because of selection. And then you could say, well, maybe, but if we have a quota, then we're going to get women from the general population, which is exactly the type of people that we need, right? And so maybe if we have a quota, then we can solve this problem. We can get the women that we want that have these desirable pro-stakeholder attitudes. But then, of course, the question is, well, if you have the quota, then you're not picking someone up off the street, right? You're still choosing from a certain population of women. And even if they're more pro-stakeholder than women in countries without quotas, then the question is still, well, are they going to be more pro-stakeholder than the men on the board? And so here, this is the exercise that I'm doing. I'm asking, are female directors like the population across these different types of selection mechanisms? And so it's very simple. I'm just saying, so I divide the sample. So for example, in the top left, I say, well, here's the set of, these are the directors in countries with co-determination. So co-determination, yes. Here are the directors in countries without co-determination. And then I'm regressing shareholderism on the female dummy to see whether, essentially, if you're in the policy country, are the women essentially less pro-shareholder than the men? so more pro-stakeholder, which is what the standard argument is. And here you can see there is a negative coefficient, but it's not significant. So, I guess that's not totally compelling evidence that they're less pro-shareholder. Now, if we go to any quota, I'm doing the same exercise. So if you're in a country with a quota, are the women going to be less pro-shareholder than the men? And actually here, the coefficient is positive. Also not significant, but it's not negative and significant, which is what you might expect. And then we can break this down by quota or by state-owned quota, still no significant negative. If we look at down here in the bottom row, if we look at ownership, so if you're in countries with high ownership concentration versus low ownership concentration, well, even in countries with high ownership concentration, the women may be more pro-shareholder. In particular, the contractual shareholderism is now negative. Is now significant. The coefficient is positive and significant. So even in countries with high ownership concentration, you get this that the women are more extreme in their pro-shareholder stances. Now we can look at whether you're an executive or you're not an executive. And you see that even if you're not an executive, the female directors may be more pro-shareholder than the men. And then we can do the same thing for expatriates. And here also, whether you're an expatriate or not, the women are more pro-shareholder. And so, basically, what I'm trying to argue is it's not necessarily clear that simply implemented the policy will shift the attributes in the direction that people argue is necessary. Okay, so my timer just went off. So, all right, so let me just wrap up. Policies may result in women who look more like the population, but even so, the shareholderism differences between women and men are not statistically significant in policy countries. Now, when we think about how we achieve corporate or societal goals, it's true that we might want to think about choosing the right people to sit on boards. So some of my work on values suggests that, well, actually having the right values is really important. But what I'm trying to argue is that this is actually a little bit more complicated than just putting women on boards. And the reason is, sort of obvious, but a lot of the discussion around this doesn't seem to recognize this. Not all women think the same, and not all men think the same either. And the way that women think, and also the way that men think, is shaped by the processes that inform whether or not people reach the boardroom. And so I think my results suggest that selection matters. In particular, it's not just about preferences, I think. So the evidence that the type of selection mechanism seems to play a role in shaping the attributes that directors have suggests that it's also about the demand side. All right, so that's it for me, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Renée, for the fascinating research and the very interesting results as well. So I don't see any question being asked in the Q&A box, but I see that we have some very good questions that are asked in the chat. The first one is from Maggie. Sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly. She's asking if can you repeat what men or women self-direction mean?
Okay, yeah. And sorry that I probably skipped over this a bit quickly, but basically in Schwartz human value framework, there's 10 human values, and one of the values is self-direction. And essentially what this means is, the label is supposed to be a little bit self-explanatory. It means that you act independently. So, that's a very short definition, but
yeah, thank you so much. And Anne-Marie, I see that you asked a couple of questions. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions, please? Is she still in the room? Oh, yeah,
Yes,
good.
I'm still in the room. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just wondering if the alignment between men and women had perhaps to do with the education that directors typically get, business education, assuming that directors are maybe 40, 50 years of age, that would mean that they'd have come through the system when most universities and that would have taught a shareholder emphasis approach to it. So I'm just wondering if that actually causes some standardization
Yeah,
may
that's
result from it.
entirely, yeah, that's entirely possible. So I mean, the survey data, I guess I didn't emphasize this. So the data was actually collected in 2011. And I would argue that back then, the directors were like people weren't talking so much about sustainable governance back then. So you could argue, well, back then people were caring about, shareholders more than stakeholders. But actually, what I also didn't show you is if you look at the data, I would argue that directors are actually, as a whole, not as pro-shareholder as one might think. So even in a time period when shareholder value maximization was more dominant, people weren't discussing this issue. I would say the directors don't look as like it seems like they balance the interests of shareholders and stakeholders pretty evenly. But the sort of standout finding is that the women are more pro-shareholder. And so you could argue, well, this makes a lot of sense. I see Kostas had a point here because, when the goal is to maximize shareholder value, the women who are going to be put in these positions are going to be the ones who they're pretty sure are going to satisfy the mission, right? But that's part of the point, right? That's part of the point that we have to be a bit careful about making assumptions about individual attributes without recognizing the role of selection processes.
Okay. But could it be that women are more rule abiding, particularly when you mentioned that their contract, that they have a more positive relation when it comes to contract stakeholders, in which case the situation might be different now when sustainability is actually important and women directors now might have more of a focus on that?
I guess, yeah, I guess I would have to say that I don't know, right? I think it
Okay.
depends on who's chosen. I guess, yeah. So I guess my point is just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're more pro-shareholder or pro-stakeholder,
Okay.
right? It's much more complicated than that. And I think we have to be careful in making that assumption. It could be that because also now there's more women might be chosen just to satisfy sustainability roles. Right. So they might end up looking more pro-stakeholder just because they're chosen to be more pro-stakeholder. But then again, that's about the selection process, right? It's not that women are in general more pro-stakeholder, it's that they were selected to fulfill a certain role. And so I think we have to be, again, going back to my point, I think we have to be careful to talk about attributes without recognizing the role of the selection process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. We have, I believe that Renée, you have already answered Kostas' question. So I'm just going to move to the next one from Dr. Moshtaq. He's asking, did you include religion in your analysis because it can also play a part in some countries?
Okay, so that's interesting. So it's the role in board selection. So we didn't include religion, but we do have in some analyses, which I didn't. So I did show you the country fix effects analysis. And so even if you put country fix effects in the regression, it's still the case that the female directors are more pro-shareholder on average. So that would be potentially a control for religion, but not necessarily. But no, we haven't examined that in great detail, but I'm intrigued that you think that this plays a role in board selection. So that would be interesting to look at. And
Yes.
so if I could make one point, that I hope that the fact that maybe the results seem a bit counterintuitive suggests that I think there's a lot of scope for interesting research in this space. And so, what I've mentioned, I said, well, look, I don't know if this is, the individuals choosing or the individuals being chosen. I think there's some evidence that it's about how they're selected, but much more work really needs to be done in this area. So I hope that people will find it interesting enough to do more research.
Yeah, very good. Thank you so much. Do we have anyone else who wants to unmute themselves and ask questions?
If I may, Renee, just to build on my question, because you know that in many jurisdictions, including the UK, there is a discussion about changing corporate acts, corporate law effectively, to try to incorporate a more stakeholder kind of approach. Do you expect then to see different selection processes in order to try to match, or do you believe corporate law, or do you believe that shareholder is going to prevail one way or another in the selection process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. So if I go back to yeah, so the paper that we're sort of building on, actually part of the point of that paper was to ask a question of what role does the law play, right? Because there is this, as you say, there's this debate about whether the law should be changed. And actually, one of the main points of the paper was to show that directors' attitudes toward shareholders and stakeholders does not vary with the legal regime, which we thought was interesting. My co-author is a corporate law scholar, and so he was like super excited about this. And I'm like, but what do you mean? Like you're writing yourself out of out of business, right? Because if the law doesn't matter, you have no job. Right. But anyhow, so he was like, oh yeah, this is like super interesting that the law doesn't matter. And it seems to be more about personal values and, culture, which seems to be really important. So will this change when the law changes? And it could change. It depends on whether, yeah, I don't know. So I think there's many interesting questions, right? But I think understanding how directors are chosen, which I would also say we don't really know much about, right? Like how do boards choose nominee? It's like I don't know, right? So and is that itself a function of the law, and how does that work? I don't know. So I think there's many interesting questions for research. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And also, Colleen just asked that what does this mean in terms of solutions to this? Amend selection process, training, especially business education, or any views on that?
Yeah, okay. So I think my findings highlight, well, so if you read between the lines, what I'm basically arguing is that we shouldn't stereotype women, which, and then as soon as you say we shouldn't stereotype women, it also means we shouldn't stereotype men, right? So I think formulating policies on the basis of assumptions about individual attributes is dangerous ground, right? So, like if you appoint a woman, does that mean they're going to be more pro-stakeholder? And I hope my evidence suggests that not necessarily. They may be more pro-stakeholder, but not necessarily. Just by being a woman doesn't mean you're necessarily more pro-stakeholder. It also doesn't mean necessarily we could get into a whole discussion about the recent backlash against DEI and the meritocracy. I would argue that, if you think having more women means you're going to have less merit, my results suggest the opposite, actually, that because if you think the objective of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value, the women do a better job in thinking about shareholder value, right? But I think these assumptions about individual attributes, we have to be very careful about. So, I mean, I guess that's policy implication number one, that we shouldn't formulate policy on the basis of assumptions about attributes. But then also the mere fact that selection exists highlights that there's barriers for women that are different than the barriers for men. And so should there be policies, and then I guess this would be a point where one could talk again about the backlash against DEI. Should we break down these barriers? And I would argue that the results suggest say yes, we need more policies that break down barriers for women to achieve greater representation. How will that change the boardroom? We don't really know because I think we haven't started thinking about this in depth enough. But will it necessarily worsen the boardroom? And I would think my evidence suggests that no, right? It won't necessarily worsen the boardroom. So yeah, so I think now, like, do we need general training for directors? Sure, right? I mean, actually, it seems like a pretty difficult job, especially in this current environment. So, whatever support they need, I would say we should give it to them. But more generally, we need to break down barriers for women to enter into boardrooms.
Yeah, very, very good, very interesting. And a last question from Shihui. She's asking, given the global push for ESG, EDI disclosure, what policy measure do you believe are most effective in enhancing genuine gender diversity rather than symbolic compliance?
Mm, yeah, that's a really, really tricky one, right? So as a governance scholar, okay, so I'm a governance person, right? I generally believe that transparency and accountability is important. But we all know that there's a lot of box ticking. And so is that transparency? Is that accountability? I mean, I would say no, right? So recently, so I'm working on a paper right now, actually using data from the NHS. And there, what we find, so what we look at is who talks about diversity in the boardroom. And it turns out it's not necessarily the women, but it tends to be the HR director. And now you may say, well, that's totally obvious because that's the HR director's job. And then my point is, but that's exactly the point. If you make it someone's job, then maybe things will happen. But if you don't make it someone's job, if you just say, "Oh, let's have more women," and then, that's diversity, I would argue that's not true. That's not diversity. So yeah. So is there an effective policy out there? I'm not necessarily sure that I know that there's an effective one. I know there's lots of ineffective ones. But then hopefully, again, by like recognizing that they're ineffective or they make flawed assumptions, we can build better policies, right? So I go back to my point that we need more research, more discussion of these issues, and definitely not less discussion and not less attention to this issue, as some people might argue.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. So I don't see any more question. I just want to thank everyone for your thoughtful questions, and also a special thanks to Professor Renée for sharing her research and the interesting findings. Thank you so much. And also, please connect with us. You know, our LinkedIn page, Corporate Governance Special Interest Group. We have two other members, Kostas and she who is here as well today. Let us know your feedback, comments, if you have any suggestions that we can improve these workshops, these knowledge lab sessions. Please let us know. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And sorry my camera was frozen the whole time. So
It's okay.
anyhow.
Don't worry. Thank you so much.